Hi guys, and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to go through some of my favourite ways to utilise natural light. If you guys have been following me for a while on YouTube or on Instagram, then you'll know that most of my work, most of my portrait work is shot with natural light. I just personally love the look of natural light and the results that you can achieve from it. Another thing I love about using natural light is that it kind of gets you used to problem solving, because the natural light, the light source, is something that you can't control. You just have to kind of come up with the solutions with whatever the sun is kind of presenting you with. I think this is a really good way of trying to get you to think on your feet and come up with solutions, because that kind of way of thinking is a really critical skill when it comes to anything creative, especially photography. So I'm going to be going through 3 different techniques. So that's using direct sunlight, using backlighting, a technique called backlighting, and also shooting in the shade. If you're shooting with natural light, then the chances are one of these 3 options is going to be made available to you. So let's start with direct light, as I know it's something that a lot of people find daunting. When we are shooting in direct light, it can cause a lot of different problems. So when we're talking about direct light, we are talking about where the sun is behind the photographer and shining onto the model. This is going to cause some issues, such as the model squinting occasionally, the sun's in their eyes, they might look a little bit uncomfortable, and you're also going to get some really harsh shadows. So these shadows usually form underneath the eyes, especially with women who are wearing like fake lashes and stuff like that, and sometimes under the nose, under the eyebrows, depending on their facial structure, sometimes, below the chin. But that being said, you can get some really amazing results when it comes to shooting in direct light. You just kind of have to work with it to solve those issues. My first tip would be to look for interesting shadows or interesting reflections. Often when you have a really harsh light source, you're going to find these kind of things. Buildings are going to create shadows. If you're near water, that's going to reflect into the image. And looking for those little pockets of light where light is coming through something and looking a little bit dappled or a little bit dispersed in an interesting pattern, that can be a really useful technique to integrate into your photos. Something that I like to do is, if I do find like a little pocket of light where there is a really strong direct light source, but there's a lot of shadow as well, I'll put the model into that situation and move them about until I get a desired effect. So something I like a lot, and something that I used in this recent shoot, was kind of creating a shape within the face. So here you can see I kind of created a shape around the eyes, and this just brings in like an extra dynamic to your work. But if you don't have something casting shadows yourself, then you can try to get the model to do that for you. So a common one is having someone put their hand out in front of their face or above their eyes, and this is going to cast a shadow downwards, or the shadow of their hand on the face, and you can kind of try and play with that. That's always fun. That's always a great way to get creative. There are other things you can do to try to avoid those harsh shadows. So for example, you could use a reflector. And if you don't know what a reflector is, it is essentially something that is going to reflect light into your image. So I use a 3-in-1 reflector on occasion, and that has kind of a gold, warmer kind of reflector, a silver one, and then a white one as well. If you don't have a reflector of your own, you can use something that will reflect the light. So white card or tin foil, they're kind of common DIY reflectors. And essentially what you want to do is you just want to angle this reflector so that the light bounces off of the reflector and fills in those shadows. Another way you can achieve this is by asking the model to lean back into the sun. Obviously then the light is going to hit directly onto their face and fill in those shadows for you. You might want to go with like a closed eye kind of thing for this though, because obviously you don't really want them to be looking directly into the sun. When it comes to your settings, there are a few different ways that you can kind of deal with the bright light. So when we are shooting with a digital camera, the idea is to underexpose your image rather than overexpose it. This is because your camera is going to be able to save a lot more of the information in the shadows than it will in the highlights. So if you blow out your highlights completely, that's going to be really hard to retrieve that information and bring it back. But if you kind of, you underexpose your shadows, your camera's going to save a lot more information there. So when it comes to post-production, you're going to be able to recover that information a lot easier. So in that sense, I'd always recommend exposing for the skin. So as long as the skin is properly exposed, it doesn't really matter if the shadows are underexposed, because you can bring that up in post-production. It's also a really good idea to get to know your camera here, because different cameras can deal with the dynamic range and that latitude a little bit better. So for example, if I'm shooting on my Canon 6D Mark II, then I know that that's not going to deal with, you know, underexposing too much or overexposing too much, as well as my Sony a7 III will. If you are trying to expose properly for the image and, you know, you don't want to lose that depth of field, you want to still be shooting on a wide aperture, then a good idea is to bring up your shutter speed or invest in an ND filter. I'm actually using an ND filter on this video today. And essentially an ND filter allows you to change the exposure without having to change your shutter speed or your aperture, etc. So whilst you want to remember to underexpose when it comes to digital, when it comes to shooting on film, then overexposing is the way to go, because film works in an opposite way, in the sense that it records better details in the highlights than it does in the shadows. When we underexpose with film, you tend to kind of get a muddy look in the shadows, whereas when you overexpose, you're able to save some of that detail. It does depend on the film that you're shooting on, so have a look and a research into your film and the latitude and how well it's going to handle overexposing a few stops or underexposing a few stops. A common film is Portra 400, because this deals really well with, you know, a couple of stops either way if needs be. So next up, let's talk about backlighting. And backlighting is definitely my favorite way to use natural light. You'll see it a lot in my work. I usually always use backlighting because I just love the effect that it has. Backlighting is especially effective during sunset or at a time of day where you have that really low sun. So backlighting is great because it kind of creates a really soft light look, a really low contrast, and it does generally help to retain some of the detail in the background. Unless of course you are shooting against a sky or something where your subject is almost silhouetted. One of the things I love about backlighting is this kind of like rim of light that you get around the head or the hair, and it just kind of like illuminates the side of someone's head. An easy way to ensure that you are backlighting a subject is to ask them to face their shadow. This is something I also use a lot when it comes to wedding groups, because with wedding groups, obviously you don't want them all to be squinting, and it's hard enough already to get a picture where no one's blinking, no one's got their eyes shut, no one's putting a funny face. So adding squinting into the mix can be just a whole heap of stuff I don't want to deal with. So getting them to face their shadow and them not having to deal with that harsh light in their eyes is a great way to kind of save that hassle in post. When it comes to backlighting your subject, if you do want to put a little bit more light into the subject so that they're not silhouetted against the background, then you could use a reflector to bounce some light into the image. So the third and final way of using natural light that I want to talk about is shooting in the shade. And this is probably the easiest of the three options and the most common natural light technique, because it doesn't really rely on a bright sunny day. So the great thing about shooting in shadow is that it's not as unpredictable as when you're shooting with direct sunlight or when you're shooting backlit or something like that. But it being so easy in that sense comes with some sort of drawback, in the sense that you don't always have the same kind of contrast and the same pop to your subject's skin as you would with direct light. Essentially though, it does make it very easy to expose for your subject and have the detail in the background as well as in your subject and maybe your foreground if that's what you're kind of going for. If you want to kind of add an extra dynamic, then I'd look for somewhere where it's in the shade but maybe sun is kind of like peeking through, so maybe in like dappled light under some trees or something. That can look quite nice because it creates an almost like spotlight effect on the subject. You can of course use a reflector to bring in a little bit more light into these scenarios if you do want to add that little bit of pop onto the subject's skin, but I find that generally speaking this is the easiest way to use natural light. You might not get the most dynamic results when it comes to shooting in shade, but it does make your job a lot easier and you can kind of focus on the concept and the composition. But like I said, when it comes to shooting in natural light, backlighting my subject is definitely my favourite look, especially when it comes to wedding portraits. I find that that kind of rim around the subject makes it kind of look a little bit more magical, and you know, it's a wedding day, so that's always a great thing to think about. But I do hope you enjoyed this video. I'm going to link the ND filter and the reflector in the description if you do want to check those out. But with all three of these tips, you don't need to have any other equipment other than just your camera. If you did enjoy this video, then please do give it a thumbs up and remember to subscribe. I try to create weekly videos around photography, so if you are new to this channel, I've got a ton of content from behind the scenes to tutorials that you can have a look through. But thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.